Wuthering Waves is better than ever with the 2.0 update, featuring a new region, new bosses and characters, numerous quality of life updates, and of course the ability to fly. About 6 months ago, I made an hour-long video about Wuthering Waves where I talked about my impressions and reviewed the game at the same time. So with the 2.0 update bringing Rinascita to the game, I figured might as well do it again for this update, but with more structure to the video and script. I will cover my impressions of pretty much everything I came across in Rinascita, including bosses, side quests, and the aesthetics of the region. So without further ado, let's begin. The main quest starts at the Black Shores, where the shorekeeper informs the rover that there is something wrong with Abby, the little mascot that I barely tolerate, and that the people in Rinascita, the land of echoes, would probably figure out what's wrong with him and fix the problem. We'll get back to this main goal later. For now, it is enough to get us to sail to Rinascita. On the trip, players first encounter PGR's Narwhal, which appeared in the update that saved that game. Coincidentally, it seems that Wuthering Waves is in the best state it has been with the arrival of this update. Players are then introduced to Brand, who will be playable in the future. So, the first thing I expected was to be able to try him out during the main quest, especially since the first combat encounter takes place before players are introduced to anyone else. Unfortunately, this does not happen, for reasons I'll go into later. Brand has a nice outfit, though his colors do clash a bit. Still, his behavior, animations, and voice performance give off a great first impression. My first interaction with Brand was when I noticed the increase in the character's model quality, namely the addition of fabric textures. This is also the first time players see friendly echoes walking among humans. This detail plays a big role in the setting of Rinascita. However, since echoes are basically the remaining frequencies of defeated TDs, I wonder if the people of Rinascita, or at least the ones at the top, used violence as a means to subjugate and control these echoes. When arriving in Ragusa City, the first area featured in Rinascita, players will also be introduced to a few more characters. Cristoforo is a minor character here, though his design and dialogue hints at a larger role in the future. He's a decent character, though his Lady Maria-esque outfit seems to suggest that someone in Kuro is a Bloodborne enjoyer. Phoebe is introduced as soon as players step foot in Ragusa City. She is a pure and precious being with the squishiest cheeks in Rinascita. She is also a member of the Order of the Deep, which is the main religion in Rinascita, and she plays a supporting role in the first half of the main story. As for Ragusa City, it is ruled by the Order, with two rival mafia gangs, the conservative Physalis and progressive Montellis, seeking to tip the balance of power in their favor. The Black Shores is friendly with the Montelli family, so the rover is gifted some funds for his or her stay in Ragusa City. For their next task, players are to visit the Alvarado Bank for the first time to withdraw these funds. This is when Zani is introduced. She is the most popular character by far, for obvious reasons, and the developers wasted no time giving us a feast with their camera angles. Unlike Sanhua in 1.0, she actually plays her role as bodyguard, accompanying the rover for about half of the main story, along with Phoebe. Carlotta is the next major character to be introduced. Although she stalks the rover in the beginning and doesn't reveal her name till about halfway through the main story, she quickly shows that she is not a threat. Carlotta is the one who invited the rover to the region in the first place, which explains her amicable behavior from the beginning. This is obviously an improvement from many other characters, especially the ones from 1.0, so I have to give the writers credit here. If I had to choose, I'd say that, based on their involvement in the main story, Carlotta and Brand are the best choices for the first playable character in Rinascita, and it seems that whoever the developers favored, Carlotta was chosen in the end, which I believe was the right choice to make. The last major character, Rocha, is introduced much later in the story. She likes to hide in her suitcase, as is the case when the rover first meets her on Brand's ship, if a giant floating echo can be considered a ship. She is also quite cute, and since this is Kuro we're talking about, that also means she has a tragic backstory. Overall, I'd say that all these characters are either well written as they are, or just interesting enough for players to be excited for their appearances in future story chapters. For Kuro, it means that it'll be easier to encourage players to pull for these characters. And for us, it just means that we have more characters to enjoy and root for. As for Ragusa City, I don't like how small it is, especially when compared to the open world, which I will get to later. Not counting the massive cathedral, Ragusa City is made up of a central plaza, a market, a few docks, a single canal and a couple of streets, with a whole quarter of the city being the Montelli estate. Since it lacks the verticality that Jinzhou has, making up for it with horizontal space should be a decision that comes naturally. Unfortunately, the developers decided that more work should go into the open world, leaving the city kind of odd in terms of layout and size. Personally, I'd prefer if there was at least an additional layer of streets surrounding the city square, as that would at least make the setting more believable. But it turns out the designers decided that this layout was fine as is. Additionally, players may notice that many buildings were simply scaled up, leading to doors, windows, and other details being up to twice the size of what they should be. At first, I thought that this only applied to the new contents, but upon returning to Jinzhou, I found that structures being scaled up has always been a thing. I would really prefer if they weren't, but for now I guess I'll tolerate this. Another small detail is that for some buildings, the display properties of front-facing windows were copied to angled windows, leading to interior details that don't make much sense. All this, coupled with the small size of the city, indicates that there was probably a tight deadline, so I can understand why they did it. Fortunately, what is there is pretty cool, and it's easy to be immersed in the settings thanks to the developers' attention to detail. The city inspired by Venice looks wonderful aesthetically and is full of life and details. There are music player echoes for players to access and play tracks collected from the open world, like sea shanties from Assassin's Creed Black Flag, a bank for an old currency unique to Rinascita's open world, and a new shop that sells Ascension materials for characters, including those that are not playable yet. Players are also able to board gondolas and tub pubs just for the sake of sightseeing, and almost every part of the map includes NPCs that rotate depending on the time of day, with different NPCs showing up on different days. My favorite little detail in the city is the Plushie Squad, a band that consists of 2 to 4 plushies that also double as open world enemies. There are 1 or 2 spots where they are guaranteed to show up, and more where they are not. There can be multiple bands at a time, and most of the NPCs around them also vary from day to day. There is one interesting detail here, and that is the track tied to the Plushie Squad seems to be split into 4 parts, which can be toggled depending on which plushies are present. This is because each one has a different instrument, and it wouldn't make sense for the whole track to play if 1 or 2 of them are absent. The only band that I've come across that always has 4 plushies is the one at the city square fountain at night, so I tend to go there just to listen to the music. Also, on a side note, confetti physics exists. This is completely unnecessary, but adds quite a bit to the atmosphere. I don't know how much this affects performance since each piece is probably its own object, but since the developers found a way to give players the ability to fly without affecting load times too much, I'd say it's probably not a big issue. As for the main story, I'm glad that it takes a while for the plot to get going, as in the rover and by extension the player is incentivized to roam the city as a tourist before the action starts. The developers also included a permanent event which has players explore the city and the surrounding region, collecting rewards and lore tidbits along the way. I'm a big fan of this old-timey aesthetic with photos and stamps. After exploring the city, I went on a date with Zani at Margarita's place, which predictably goes awry when two performing echoes go haywire and deliver a message from the Sentinel. This quickly leads to an investigation which includes a thorough exploration of the Order's cathedral. I bet this is not against the rules. Damn it, I can't get up there. I don't see any items up here. Man, it feels like I'm playing Assassin's Creed right now. Unfortunately, there are no hidden items or secrets in the main hall, to my knowledge. After getting his or her muddy footprints all over the floor, as well as an achievement for doing so, the rover proceeds to the backyard and takes an elevator which triggers this beautiful cutscene. The artists somehow always find a way to make their environments more and more beautiful with each new region, and this is no exception. Personally, I'm very impressed with what's on display here, and if the time I spent in photo mode proves anything, it's that I won't be leaving anytime soon. I didn't notice this till later, but the player is able to view all the major landmarks from this starting point, just like Dark Souls 3. This is because the landmarks are arranged in a semicircle, with the middle of the region being lowered. Players who are familiar with From Software games will immediately recognize a few things that were introduced with this update, the first being the general layout and aesthetic of the open world, its inspiration being obvious from this vantage point. Rinascita is made up of a lower central region surrounded by highlands, and the developers in charge of the open world made sure it was a success. The region is filled with content such as puzzles and bosses along with new enemies and collectibles. In other words, the general stuff we've come to expect from this game by now. It's pretty good, all things considered. When first encountering the new enemies, I was pleased to find out that most of them have fun movesets, and that many of them have unique mechanics. Some plushy enemies can do special attacks together. The Chop Chop enemy type can either be encountered as a single enemy, or as 3 individual parts. The Knight enemies can buff their weapons with 3 different elements. And the Nimbus Wraiths cry when low on health before disappearing, and can heal the player if they are close by. As before, enemies can and will fight each other in certain areas, which I found out as I was trying to take a photo of Zani. Frexidus enemies who also appear in Rinascita have set up multiple camps in the area, which is far more believable as they didn't have these structures before. Another piece of environmental detail that made me realize that some developers at Kuro are fans of From Software games, specifically Elden Ring, is the fact that the developers scaled up most of the structures to make them seem larger than they should be. Just like in Raguna City, the open world is filled with abnormally large wooden planks, comically wide stairs and bridges, and extremely large structures such as the Alvarado Vault and the Thorn Crown Rises. As I stated earlier, this is an aesthetic trait that I dislike, but I won't go so far as to call it a big issue. Gameplay-wise, scaling up these structures means that it will take longer for players to explore, especially for those like me who want to ascend every tower they see. This becomes less of an issue since players can now fly, especially when their flight stamina, which I refer to as fuel, can be increased by reaching exploration milestones. While the landscape and giant architecture of the structures in Rinascita remind me of Elden Ring, the color palette and tone of this entire region remind me a lot of Toussaint, the region featured in The Witcher 3's second DLC, Blood and Wine. In contrast to the rest of the game, Toussaint is a bright and lively region with rolling hills and vineyards, and knights obsessed with tourneys and noble virtues. To further push this point, the saturation of the entire region is greatly increased. In Wuthering Waves, Rinascita is even brighter and more lively compared to all the regions featured so far, and the main quest revolves around a festival called the Carnevale. Just like Toussaint, the colors painted on the landscape are more saturated than ever before. Tonally, Rinascita is a breath of fresh air. For once, the threat of TDs and impending doom can be put aside and the characters can relax and celebrate for a while, but this should not be the standard for future story chapters. I said before in my 1.0 video that the developers had intended the game to have a darker and more serious tone, a post-apocalyptic setting and a very desaturated color palette, and that I was disappointed that they decided to let go of their vision a bit in the final product. With Update 2.0, it seems that Kuro Games have decided to go even further from their original vision, at least in tone and color palette, and at least in this update. This has, of course, caused a bit of an issue for the developers. Wuthering Waves, despite being more popular than ever, seems to be stuck between having a dark and gritty setting with occasional bright moments, and a bright and lively setting with occasional dark moments. I hope that the developers have not forgotten that their designs and environments were supposed to have a serious vibe overall, and I would be disappointed if they decided to fully let it go in order to draw a wider and perhaps younger audience. It always sucks when artists sacrifice their vision to chase more material gains, and I hope it doesn't happen to Kuro. If anything, I hope that the next region has a more serious vibe and returns to a less saturated color palette. The amount of color used in every region before Rinascita strikes a nice balance between the two extremes, and if anything, I hope that the developers will return to that color palette soon. If that happens, Rinascita will likely be remembered fondly among Wuthering Waves players, like how Toussaint is among Witcher 3 players, as the one region that is bright and cheerful in a dark and gritty setting, at least on the surface. Let's return to the main story. Ever since Mount Firmament, every main story quest has brought players throughout the entire region, unlocking resonance beacons and exploration milestones along the way. This is a great way to seamlessly tie in the open world with the main quest because supporting characters tend to explain the lore and history of each major landmark in the region as the story progresses. The main quest in Rinascita also brings the rover to pretty much all the main bosses introduced with the region, and since the open world is tied into the main story, the characters are also there to provide more context and weight to each of these encounters. I hope Kuro continues to do this with future regions because Rinascita's main story is the best one so far, and the decision to include these boss fights was a key contributing factor. In comparison, 1.0's main story was all over the place, not only in writing but also in location, with most of these open world stories being relegated to exploration quests. While these are of good quality in and of themselves, the region of Huanglong ended up being disconnected from the main story, not to mention bosses didn't really have unique stories themselves. The same cannot be said for 2.0, and I'm glad that the developers chose to make these changes. One of the most memorable moments in the story takes place in and around the Alvarado Vault, which includes Carlotta breaking into her own vault and exposing traitors in the ranks. The entire sequence is fun and interesting to play through, not to mention surprising since I didn't expect a heist section anywhere in this game, let alone the main story. The following segment in the vault provides some interesting lore before leading our characters to the tower once forbidden to the Montellis. Here, more is revealed about the Order and their villainy is put on full display. This was when our characters discovered that the Order had been hiding the truth of Raguna's history from its people for decades, manipulating them through strict rules, sermons, and in-universe lore retcons. This was when I held some hope that by the end of this story chapter, the Order would be reformed or abolished. This is not the case, and although I was initially disappointed by the lack of progress, I'm quite glad that the writers chose not to change anything right now. I will explain this in detail later, but for now I'll continue with the main story. After faking a betrayal to keep the Montelli family within the good graces of the Order, probably so that she can manipulate the Order in the future, Carlotta allows the rover to visit an island called Penitence End. Here, the rover is repeatedly attacked by a classic Dark Souls bridge dragon and must fight his or her way to the island. Curiously, this is the first time that the Havoc version is used as a trial character, which could be a mistake as the Spectral version has always been used. The next section of the story involves the island itself and the dragon as a boss. Curiously, Penitence End is the one location that looks so out of place compared to the rest of Rinascita that I wonder if it was even supposed to be in the same update. While the visual tone of the entire region is bright and idyllic, this one is the exact opposite. This part of the story is where players are properly introduced to Rocha, who plays a big role here. This was when I noticed that the developers had each new character feature in a sizable portion of the main story, since each of them are given ample screen time for development. I'm sure that the writers wanted to prevent the 1.0 issue of some playable characters having no presence in the main story from ever happening again, so having these new characters essentially take turns to leave an impression on players and contribute to the main objective was a great decision on their part. She is also the only child character in the main story, which probably means that she is the next playable character, as she is the only one whom Kuro deemed polished enough to feature in the current update. This was also where I got myself soft-locked by casting Rocha's super move beside a Corroder, which somehow spawned a new Corroder to follow me. Wow, that's a good animation right there. Not only was I unable to use this one on the objective, but since the game thought I picked it up, it also prevented me from collecting the actual one and finishing the objective. I had to quit out of the game and log back in to fix the issue. It only happened once and I'm not sure if anyone else encountered it, but I thought it was too big of an issue to leave it be, so I reported it to the developers. The boss of this island, the Dragon of Dirge, acts as a servant of the Order. Somehow, they've been able to command it to eliminate anyone they didn't like, the same people they labeled fools for questioning their flawed religion. The same people they sent here to die. The dragon is a pretty cool boss, and the music is fantastic as usual. Soon after, we visit the residence of the Troop of Fools, and I think that going from showing us what would happen to these people if they hadn't escaped to how many there are in the troop is a good decision because it highlights the actions of Brandt and his crew. Here, the final piece of Raguna's photo book can be taken, and players are able to get quite a bit of dialogue if they take the time to interact with every NPC. I didn't expect this to be the case, so I missed a few important bits here, including dialogue for Brandt. The most memorable moment in this segment for me is the dance involving Rover and Carlotta. As with almost all other cutscenes in this game, it's well animated with good lighting and camera angles. However, I couldn't appreciate its quality in the moment because there are QTEs during the dance. Whoa. I did not expect that. I'm trying to enjoy the animation here, but I have to do quick time events. And I'm clicking on these with the mouse because the key doesn't show up always at the start, so it's just faster. That could be a wallpaper right there. I don't know what happens if the player messes it up, though I don't think it would result in anything big. After making clear our character's motivations, the player returns to Raguna City where they are given a mask that can be worn at any time. This is the first accessory in the game and there will probably be more in the future. The Carnivale looks wonderful and it's good that players are allowed to roam the area again before progressing the story. For story moments like this, the world state and NPC placement of the involved area is temporarily changed to reflect whatever the story requires. Examples from previous regions include the giant mushroom tree in the dim forest, the environment and the moon in the Norfall Barrens, and PGR's red and blue towers in the Tessis system. Ever since 1.0, I've been hoping that players would be able to toggle between these world states after finishing the main story, especially for those that always look good regardless of story progression. The Carnivale is the best example of this as the city looks consistently great before, during, and after the event. The festive mood, the increased confetti particles in the air, and the placement of additional NPCs during the event are all things that I'd like to be able to witness at any time, and I really hope that the developers implement this in the future. I'd probably never shut up about this until they do, so expect this point to be brought up again in a future video. What happens next is the culmination of all this build-up, with Frolova taking center stage while our characters put up a show. A ton of work was put into this part alone, and it really shows with the excellent cinematography of these cutscenes. Much like 1.0's Dreamless, Hecate is the final boss of the main story, and it is the best one by far. During this time, Frolova speaks of prophecies and stuff that still aren't clear to me. The presentation here is flawless and the boss itself is very enjoyable to fight. However, there are yet again certain moves that only show up when the player encounters the boss in the story. Granted, most of these moves are mostly for presentation purposes, so they kind of waste the player's time, but it would be nice if players could choose to play the story or weekly version of the boss when fighting them again. Just like Dreamless, Hecate's moveset in its weekly version seems kind of incomplete. I should probably also mention that Hecate has two specific combos that call back to PGR, namely to Lithos with its converging saw blade combo. Okay Lithos, I recognize that. And the Hetero Hive Mother with its 5-hit parry combo. Ah, damn it. Oh, all of this can be parried. Okay, Dreamless. This is followed by another breathtaking cutscene that closes out this chapter of the main story. The Sentinel then speaks to the Rover, confirming my early suspicions during the date with Zani that this Sentinel is also related to the Rover, and that all Sentinels could be related as well. However, the main purpose for coming to Rinascita, which is to diagnose and fix Abby, is not brought up again. This would probably be a major plot point for a future story chapter, but I was quite disappointed that Abby's problem is not even addressed past the early parts of the story. After finishing the main story, I went to complete Carlotta's companion quest. This would probably be a good time for me to address Carlotta in full. In terms of gameplay, she generates and uses a resource depending on her actions. While she is a 5-star character, as well as the first pistol user to not suffer from the problem of boring and limiting mid-air and heavy attacks, she is also too low effort for me to enjoy using her much. She generates resources very quickly, but she has too many ways of doing it. This turns her into a bit of a brain-dead character gameplay-wise, which turns me away from choosing her over others, despite liking almost everything else about her. Speaking of which, let's move on to her companion story. Overall, I found it to be pretty good since her backstory and motivations are expanded upon, though I wonder why the writers chose to have her seek out traitors again in her companion quest when she already did so in the main quest. Her behavior towards the Rover in her companion quest is believable because this takes place after the main quest. I also don't mind that Carlotta falls for the rover towards the end of the main story and continues to treat the rover well, not only because of the history between their organizations, but also because this rapport is built up in a believable manner. However, Carlotta is the third female character in a row that is portrayed as being in a romantic relationship with the rover. The two characters immediately preceding her, Camellia and the Shorekeeper, both fill the same role, albeit to slightly different degrees. This has led many players to criticize the writers for using or forcing the harem trope upon the story. Wuthering Waves is meant for a more mature audience, and I think that it would be safe to say that most players who make up the developer's intended audience do not approve of or at least tolerate the trope of a main character with a harem. I hate this trope in general, and I wish it wasn't in the game, partly because the rover is somewhat of a self-insert character. That is not the only problem with the main story, of course. With the major rewrites before the game's release, the disjointed nature of the main story in Huanglong, and the rover being a godlike character that everyone seems to instantly like, I wouldn't blame the writers for not really knowing what to do next. After all, I did say many times that the writers must be very careful about how they portray the rover in the future. Since the rover is a godlike figure, it can also be difficult at times to keep the stakes high, especially since the rover is not as vulnerable as most of the other characters in the story. The inclusion of Frolova and the Fraxidus in Rinascita's main quest was a step in the right direction. It is fortunate that the writers have finally remembered the game's main villains. In addition, the stakes are automatically increased as the one who caused the TD invasion in Zinzhou is in Raguna as well. The stakes are also quite high even without her, as it is hinted that Fenrico, the current Primus of the Order, is possibly the Threnodian's resonator and has convinced everyone that he belongs to the Sentinel instead. This plot point would probably return in future story chapters, and I'm interested to see where it leads us. After completing the main story and Carlotta's companion quest, I went on to complete some side quests. 3 of them stood out as memorable quests due to their story or presentation. When I was introduced to Phoebe, I thought she was going to be a minor character for now, so I did not expect her to have her own side quest in this update. This quest goes into detail about the backstory of some open world landscapes, and out of all the characters featured so far, Phoebe and Cristoforo were the best ones to use for such a purpose. Since Cristoforo was shown to possibly be in league with the Fraxidus and thus is no longer a neutral character, Phoebe became the obvious choice, and having her go around chasing echoes is not only consistent with her behavior in the main quest, but also gives a convenient excuse for Phoebe to show the rover around. The next one involves the Thorncrown Rises, and as far as I'm aware, this is the only time where exiles are present in Rinascita. The story is serviceable, and although the ending is predictable, the characters were somewhat well written, at least in terms of minor NPCs. I enjoyed the maze aspect of the tower's magical interiors, and the verticality allowed for some nice set pieces to be made. It ends with a boss fight, and the environment here is, as always, stunning. The third side quest that I like to touch on features the minor Forbidden Archives and an NPC belonging to the Order. Earlier, I mentioned that I hoped that the Order would be reformed or abolished by the end of the story, and that I'm glad that the writers chose to keep the status quo for now. Although I'm clearly not a writer, I recognize that it is a far better choice to address this in a future story chapter, because more conflicts and drama could be woven into the plot regarding the weakening of the Order, not to mention sweeping changes to an entire society cannot and should not happen overnight. This realistic approach is quite respectable, and the writers deserve props for not giving us a happy ending right away, though it remains to be seen whether the Order will actually weaken in the future. The exploration quest regarding the Forbidden Archives shows us yet again that the writers know what they are doing when it comes to portraying religions through fiction. Throughout the quest, the rover helps a cowardly member of the Order uncover the Nimbus Corral, which should sow doubts into her, if she was a normal person. However, decades of indoctrination cannot be broken so quickly, and even if that were the case, truly freeing oneself from that mindset would require a lot of time. And so, the writers chose the realistic approach by having her deny the truth. After all, it is very difficult for one to come to terms with something that so directly questions their entire worldview. Though I was initially frustrated with her behavior, I've come to realize that the writers did a good job at portraying characters like this one. After all, achieving a desirable outcome is not always possible. As I finished most of the side quests, I moved on to exploration. This is when the ability to fly really made things a lot smoother, as it lessens the time taken to travel long distances and areas of differing elevation. The fuel capacity, while initially meager, can be increased by reaching exploration milestones, allowing for longer airtime. In terms of player tools, this is one of the most important, and although it would have been nice to have it enabled everywhere, I can see why the developers couldn't or chose not to do it. The earlier regions, especially the Black Shores, were not designed for flight in mind, and there could be a lot of issues related to collision or load zones if flight was enabled there. Still, it wouldn't be unreasonable to expect that this tool should be usable everywhere. It remains to be seen whether future regions would allow for flight, but I hope this wouldn't be the last time it makes an appearance. As for challenges and puzzles, the open world of Rinascita has a lot of them, and thanks to their inclusion, there are plenty of things to do. When it came to challenges, I found most of them to be quite difficult, especially when I wasn't yet familiar with the new enemies. All of them offer more rewards for unique actions, like reflecting chop-chop projectiles or parrying a night enemy multiple times, though it was annoying having to wait for them to perform those moves. Despite this, the toughest challenge I faced was actually juggling multiple elite enemies like Vitrium Dancers, which was particularly stressful. As for puzzles, I'm satisfied with the ones involving the paintings and the rabbit plushie, as they required some brain power to complete. As usual, they're not meant to be very difficult, so this level of simplicity is acceptable. Overall, the design and variety of both challenges and puzzles are quite good. While I explored, I noticed some things with the background music that I'd like to touch on. Earlier, I said that the open world aesthetic reminds me of Toussaint from The Witcher 3. The music, in a way, also has that vibe. Interestingly, the main Raguna motif is used in a surprisingly large number of tracks, including the ones that play during the login screen and when the player first arrives in Raguna, as well as the ones involving the plushie squad. Interestingly, some of the tracks may also hint at crucial details before the characters discover them. For example, I theorized that the lifer residing under the legally distinct minor Erd tree has been a prisoner for a very long time due to the sad tone of the accompanying track, and it turns out I was right. The same can be said for the track that plays near the Thessalia's castle of Porto Veno, which curiously resembles the track that plays in Mount Firmament. It is possible that Rinascita's Threnodian, whom the Thessalias worship, has some ties to Jue, the Sentinel of Xingzhou, though the lack of clues suggests a coincidence instead. As for the boss music, the composers chose the orchestral genre, which probably ties the bosses into the region a bit better compared to the dubstep electronic style of some of the bosses in Huanglong. After all, it would be strange if the genres didn't match. Tracks accompanying Lorelei, the Dragon of Dirge, and Hecate are particularly amazing. I've heard that Vanguard Sound Studio isn't working with Kuro Games anymore, so they had in-house composers write the music for this game. While it is sad to see the partnership end if it is true, it is still nice to see Kuro's composers experiment with different genres and styles. With the arrival of this update, many echoes were added, along with a few new sonata effects that are unique to these echoes. Honestly, I'm glad that sonata effects are not as limited as I had originally thought. If anything, it's just more options for players with different playstyles. Not all of them are a lot stronger than their older counterparts, so power creep is not a big issue for now. I hope this continues to be the case, as it would suck if everyone had to farm for newer sonata effects that were much more powerful than the ones that came before. Next, I'd like to discuss nightmare bosses, which take the form of old bosses. As for their placement, it seems that some of them look like they would fit right in with respect to their surroundings, while others look like they don't belong. Thundering Memphis and Infernal Rider's echoes have the most important changes, as their animations are greatly shortened in comparison to their regular counterparts, allowing players to spend their time in combat more efficiently. There is currently no way for players to upgrade applicable boss echoes to their nightmare versions, which is unfortunate because players looking to replace their fully built boss echoes must grind for these nightmare versions, which can be frustrating due to the random nature of the stats tied to echoes that drop, not to mention whatever stats players can obtain upon upgrading them. As for essential materials required for character progression, it was a good decision to have them only drop from the original forms of these bosses, so both versions can be farmed for different purposes. This prevents the originals from becoming obsolete, which is great. Although it would have been nice if players could also swap these echoes from their regular versions to their nightmare versions and vice versa, I get why the developers didn't do this. Speaking of swapping back and forth, Kuro has finally added the ability for players to gender bend the rover, which is a feature I had been hoping for since the game's release. Unfortunately, the option is kind of tucked away, which makes it a bit hard to find for those who don't know where to look. And for some reason, upon swapping the rover's gender, players cannot do so again for 24 hours, and will have to log in again for the changes to take effect. I'm not sure why this is the case, but if I had to guess, it would probably be server limitations or something. It can be a bit frustrating, especially for those who may want to switch often. From now, I'll probably be using male rover for the main story and female rover for exploration because I enjoy both. After all, the only reason I started as male rover was because I couldn't decide and used a coin to help me choose. Regardless of its issues, I'm glad that this feature is finally in the game. Overall, despite some concerns, I'm very satisfied with what 2.0 brought to the game, and I hope that the developers will bring us further improvements in the future. Alright, that should be everything. This video is long enough, so I'll stop here. If there's anything you'd like to share, leave them in the comments. Thanks for watching.